Welcome to Dynamically Speaking. In today's episode, we're joined by Mark Fussell, the co-creator of Dapr and the CEO of Diagrid. We'll get into everything from the origin story of Dapr to the rise of AI and agentic frameworks. We'll also explore identity and access in distributed systems and the role of CNCF and open standards in advancing innovation. Let's dive in. Welcome back to another episode of the Dynamically Speaking podcast. I'm Emme, Reichert, the marketing manager at Axiomatics, and with me, as always, is our CTO, David Brossard. Hey, David, how are you doing today?
Hello there. I'm doing great. It's a beautiful and sunny day out here in Vancouver, so I can't complain.
Well, that is awesome because we've had thunderstorms here for the past few days. So I am immensely jealous.
Go west.
Awesome. And with us today is our guest, Mark Fussell, the creator of Dapr and the CEO of Diagrid. Hey, how are you doing today, Mark?
I'm doing fantastic, and I'm just south of David in Seattle, so I too have glorious weather out west. You should come join us.
Someday.
And I thought sunshine stopped at the border. Who knew?
Well, some people would say so. Let's leave that for another topic.
That's a different podcast.
Yes. But it's fantastic to be here today. I'm excited to talk to you all about Dapr, tell you about the history, my background, and kind of take you on a journey. A lot of this to do with security, I guess we're going to dive into.
Awesome. Yes. So can you start by telling our audience a bit more about yourself and your background?
Yeah, so I'm originally from the UK, emigrated to the US in 2000, so 25 years ago, and spent 20 years of that working at Microsoft, building lots of different developer technologies. In fact, when I first joined Microsoft, XML was the big thing of the day, and I actually built the XML stack inside .NET, if you've ever used system.xml, which was one of the first things I did, but XML doesn't get talked about very much nowadays, and in fact, that may not even exist anymore.
Really? Try me. We could do everything about XML today.
Yes. But I went on and then built many other technologies and ended up early in the days of Azure and started to build the platform that runs all of the major Azure services there back in 2008. That platform was called Service Fabric, and it ran database workloads, which are kind of the hardest type of service to run because they are stateful, long-running, durable, and you have to scale them all out. So building this platform, which was a platform that actually allowed you to build other platforms on top of it all, and services, taught me a lot about building things at scale, security, distribution, how you kind of manage applications like this. And that sort of led to really realizing that, developers had to have all the responsibility of building these services on top of it all. And so started to do an open source project called Distributed Application Runtime, which was all about a set of design patterns for developers to build and not reinvent the wheel, or as I like to say, reinvent the pattern on top of running on distributed architectures. Of course, today that's mostly Kubernetes, but there was this thing called Mesosphere once and Docker Swarm and these other ones. But by providing these APIs, developers are much more productive building their applications. And that product became very successful. Donated it to CNCF. I decided to leave Microsoft and start Diagrid so we could commercialize this and sort of forge our own direction. Yeah, so that's kind of a little of my history around these.
This is thanks, Mark, for this. This is a really good lead on to a question that I had, selfishly, because I'm following a path somewhat similar to you in terms of, building standards and new technology. Why CNCF? Why did that feel like the natural place to go?
Yeah, I think that actually it's very interesting you should ask that because CNCF is we looked at a number of different organizations. It's part of the Linux org. I think that one thing that's, let's just kind of think, there's both good and bad things about this. First, the CNCF is very, very infrastructure focused today, and they're very focused on sort of Kubernetes and infrastructure layers. And in fact, in some ways, Dapr is an anomaly in there because it's much more at the application layer around those things. And so there is a a bit of contention around that, I would say. But I mean, at the same time, the CNCF has, broad reach, and it has the place for people to be able to kind of come and find the technologies. And I think that we just sort of aligned with, the so-called cloud native ecosystem around these things, and kind of Kubernetes and other platforms running on top of this as one place to align it all, and sort of to bring an application perspective into that organization as a whole. So, I mean, at the same time, of course, once you donate it to an organization, it's no longer your technology. And so you're the will of them, the organization itself. But I think they do a great job promoting it all and kind of getting the right audience to you. It's still up to the maintainers of the project, though, to keep it going. And so, you have to have a strong ecosystem underneath this. Otherwise, the projects kind of flounder and things like this. And I do think there are a few projects in CNCF that, when some of the core maintainers left, I would point to Helm as one of these, it starts to flounder a little bit more and things like this. And I think that's always a little bit of the danger that you get, where, they're solely dependent upon the supporting organizations.
But that means that the code for Dapr is then owned by CNCF, and anyone is actually welcome to contribute to the code base. And then the organizers of Dapr or another technology, they're responsible for reviewing, pull requests and these sorts of things.
Correct. Yes. I mean, it's a totally open source project. There's welcoming to anyone in the world who wants to kind of donate and become part of it all. All of the Dapr brand and the Dapr ecosystem and the Dapr code base, it's all open sourced under Apache 2 license, which makes it, very vendor neutral, which is great because people love, it can't be controlled and owned by any one organization. It's independent of all of these. And so, you can't get locked into one vendor, and you can't be kind of have the rug pulled from underneath you. But at the same time, of course, you have to have, as I said, a healthy ecosystem, and then all the code PRs get reviewed by a consortium of bodies, of which we're one. I mean, we, along with Microsoft, are sort of the primary maintainers of the project. We're increasingly taking the lead in the project, Diagrid, that is, as a company. But we have NVIDIA and Intel and many other companies that contribute to the project.
Cool. So before we dive a bit more into Dapr, one last question related to CNCF. Do you collaborate with other CNCF projects, and in particular, close to my heart are Open Policy Agent and IDQL? Are these things that pop up? Is there cross-pollination of sorts?
We haven't had deep cross-pollination with those particular projects. Particularly, some of the OAuth ones, we integrate with around those things and talk about them. But I think we probably could do a little bit more inside there. I mean, the CNCF has this concept of working groups, and that's kind of where it tries to foster this collaboration between different groups inside the organization as a whole. And I think you can try and work through some of those. But we haven't had deep collaboration. We've had integration. For example, we've done quite deep integration with Cert Manager, which is another security project inside there, which is great because it issues certificates and does trust authorities on behalf of organizations, and you can sort of pull all the certificates and from that. And I think that's great. So we've had a quite close collaboration with Cert Manager as a project. Not quite so those other two.
Cool. Thanks.
Awesome. So could you tell us a bit more about Dapr and who it's primarily aimed at?
Yes. I mean, Dapr is primarily directly aimed at application developers. And its goal is to make developers more productive building applications that run in a distributed manner. And the best example is to talk about things like event-driven applications, ones where you send messages between each other. It's very common for you to put some form of message broker into an application and send messages between things such as Kafka or RabbitMQ or one of the public cloud ones like AWS SNS or Azure Service Bus. But of course, what happens is that developers need to have the right level of abstraction on top of this. They want to have the idea of publishing a message and subscribing to a message, as simple as that. And often when you pull in like an SDK for Kafka, it's got nothing to do with this. So first, Dapr provides a sort of API around this thing. And then secondly, and those APIs allow developers to build things like pub/sub messaging. There's an API for service invocation that allows you to discover and call other services based upon their identity. It has a workflow engine built as part of it in terms of a business workflow engine that can do synchronization and effectively durable execution. It has an API for secrets management, for getting hold of secrets. It has an API for like job scheduling and things like this. So developers put all these APIs together, particularly messaging, workflow, job scheduling, secrets management, and effectively it accelerates their development because they're not reinventing the wheel doing a lot of these things. And security and observability and actually resiliency and reliability are key cross-cutting initiatives across all these APIs. And that's the benefit, is you get this end-to-end security, end-to-end observability, end-to-end resiliency and reliability, as well as productivity from the APIs. Does that make sense? So that's kind of where it comes down to. Another key element of Dapr is behind these APIs, you have the concept of a component model, which we could dive into, which provides an infrastructure abstraction.
Yeah, so I think that kind of leads into my next couple of questions, and I just thought of a new one as you were talking, Mark. So I'll start with the new one first, curveball. When you talk about security, I'm guessing it's all aspects, right? So data in transit, data at rest, authentication, authorization, any other things I'm forgetting that are certificate management I mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, there are a ton of security features in Dapr. In fact, what I think is the most underrepresented part of the entire industry is security at the application level. So let me kind of give you sort of three key elements of the security. Probably the most important one that comes from Dapr is a concept of identity. And that's identity on effectively a single process that runs. And so when you launch an application inside Dapr, it gets identity associated with it. So it might have an order processing service or a payment service, and it has a name associated with it. And you can discover this name anywhere and do authentication against it. And what happens as part of the process of starting that application identity is that Dapr is a control plane. It has a service that runs inside it called a sentry service, which is a kind of think of it as a certificate or identity authority, and it hands out the identity through a spiffy identity to each one of the services that are running so that they can actually do the underlying authentication against them. And with that spiffy identity, of course, comes associated with an X59 certificate for the underlying cryptographic attestation of what it is. But this concept of identity is so important because now as a developer, rather than what you see a lot when people build on these distributed systems is they kind of struggling to open a port and send to a DNS address and all of this network mess. Instead, a developer simply goes, hey, call the order method on the order processing application wherever it's running in my environment. And Dapr does the discovery, the connection to it all. It does the secure connection of MTLS. It calls that method. And if there's any form of retries and failures, it recovers from all of that. So all that hard work of calling a known method on a particular application, wherever it's running in your 200 machine cluster, it doesn't matter, is all taken care of for you, as one example, which I think is probably the most important thing that Dapr does.
We've come a long way from the manual process of scanning a WSDL file and SOAP-land and understanding the WS security policy files that came with it and trying to build a stub in .NET in your case or in Java or whatever other technology.
Yeah. Actually,
that's quite cool.
I was on the WS Secure Conversation, WS Schema, WS Secure Transaction, all those standard bodies from Microsoft for 5 years, and as part of Windows Communication Foundation, and it was very painful.
I can imagine. Although XML is beautiful.
Yes.
But as a side story, when we first released the Axiomatics policy decision point, so it's an authorization API. You send a request, you get a decision back. So very straightforward, right? Follows Scalable. But we decided back in the day the standard didn't really have a protocol to exchange request responses. So we built one on top of SOAP. Was the flavor du jour at the time, and that would have been okay. But then we decided to do something called mutual certificate security, which was a SOAP level MTLS of sorts, if you will. But because it was SOAP level, you had to do all these app level certificate management things, which were a total nightmare, as opposed to relying on just the transport level.
Yep, I remember it very, very well because there's all this wonderful promise of like, you could send a message and it bounces beautifully across all of these things and it doesn't, and this message level security just wraps all beautifully and you just hand a packet on and it didn't work in any way like that. You still had to unwrap the packet and do it all and send it on to the next one. It was a complete non-promise.
Yeah, it was hard. Yeah. So based on what you said, it sounds like you kind of sit in, like, if I had to put you in the ISO stack somewhere, you kind of sit in two layers, right? You definitely help simplify the transport or the lower level of the application side, right? The plumbing to the service, so that you don't have to worry about which ports to open and how to handle the MTLS, like you said. So you sit in that layer, but also very early on, you said that your focus is definitely in the application security side, right? Focusing on the business APIs, if you will. Did I understand that correctly?
Completely. It's all at the layer 7 stack entirely, really. I mean, yes, it uses a transport layer for building the communication, but this is all at the layer 7 stack in ISO. And then when you start to build these applications, you start to realize there's many more pieces around it all. So, for example, as well as kind of just finding another application through identity, you want to do sort of authentication and authorization. So you can actually then say, well, only these applications can call me because they have identity now. I'll only allow the order application, or say, let's say the let's just say the cart application to call me, my order application, and nothing else. And if it calls me, it's only allowed to call onto these particular methods that I have. So you've got this level of identity, authorization, and then authentication about what you can do at the application level. And this goes further as well, even to the messaging side of things, where if you're in a pub sub message broker, you can also say only these applications can actually attach to this particular message broker, and only these ones can actually receive and send these messages on these particular message topics between each other. So you've got sort of message level security on the message sending level, as well as at the application level about who can call what on you. And, I don't know really many other frameworks that do it in sort of such a generalized way that allow you to kind of this fine-grained security on individual, effectively, processes within inside that, or because you have this concept of identity.
That's pretty cool, and it's very much in line with trends that I'm observing. So, as part of my day job, I have the opportunity to go sometimes with Emme, actually, to conferences. So we were back in December. We were at Gartner IEM in Dallas. Back in March, we were in London. A little bit more exciting from a tourism perspective. Not so much from a weather perspective. That's a different story. And then more recently, I was in Vegas for Identiverse, and one term that comes up time and time again is non-human identity, which in a way is a generalized form of workload identity. It sounds like what Dapr enables is giving every single one of those pieces, those services, those processes, an identity so that we can enable non-human identity. And then from there on, we can enable scenarios that you mentioned, the authorization of which identity can call which other identity.
Totally, yeah. And it just opens up so many doors. I mean, I think one of the most exciting things that we've done inside the Dapr project using Spiffy to do this is that because the Sentry service hands out this identity to services, and then you can federate that service down to, say, an infrastructure service that's running on a particular cloud. And Amazon does this particularly well. They have a federated service that allows you to have Spiffy identity associated with, say, their SNS messaging service. You can now say, hey, once I get issued this certificate or this identity for this particular application, end-to-end security calls through the actual process down to the underlying infrastructure. In this case, say the SNS service, it gets authenticated there without the developer even knowing or having to care about in any form of like, oh, I've got to get hold of a particular secret of some form in order to talk to this SNS service, and where do I keep that, and where do I store it, and how do I find it all? That whole thing sort of disappears from them. And I think that's one of the best examples that you end up having where a developer's life, where security is just a nightmare and a horrible thing for them, just sort of like disappears into the background where it should be, so they can have, the nice productive world of writing code without having to manage secrets and credentials to talk to this underlying service and get hold of these. But saying that, if they do want to get hold of secrets and the credentials, Dapr does have this great secrets API that allows you to generally kind of call off and say, get a certificate, or say a secret to talk to a database service, and then without you having to sort of store this in your code. And so that's pretty common. But yeah, going back to your workload identity, I think this is probably the most under thought through representation that needs to be built into the applications in order to achieve this sort of seamless flow of identity and authorization as a result.
Yeah, and you mentioned authorization. For us, we're exclusively focused on the authorization side, the access control side of things. To be clear, having identities everywhere and having a framework like Dapr, it helps us build better authorization policies in the abstract sense of what can happen. And in particular, non-human identities, workload identities, they allow you to build the delegation use cases or the on behalf of use case. One that we're seeing more and more, I don't know if you've seen that pop up on your radar yet, is a little bit in context of AI, though we'll get back to AI later, is the travel agent use case, where a travel agent is going to book a trip on your behalf. So they're going to book a plane ticket on your behalf, and they have a limit to respect. They can't spend more than $1,000 to fly to Europe, and they're going to book a hotel for you. The dates have to match, and again, they have a budget of, I don't know, $300 a day or whatever it may be, and then they're going to book this and that on your behalf. The fact that you now have identity at the infrastructure layer, identity at the application layer through Dapr, identity at the end user layer through your traditional IAM tooling and authentication techniques, that helps us, the authorization services, build better policies that are reflective of these different identities floating around.
Yes. Actually, that's a really cool scenario. I hadn't really thought about that as much as about on the behalf of. I spend a lot of world time in working on Kerberos and all those things, and there's a lot of, in those worlds, there's a lot of on behalf of things on their behalf, and it makes total sense because you don't necessarily come across that very much that people have talked about in the cloud-native distributed world, but it makes total sense. You need to have that. And I think you've sort of triggered a thought in my mind that as we go towards this agentic world of things where people are building these agents around everywhere, if you don't give, you'll need to have this for the agents. So they say, here's my access token or my credit or my kind of authorization that you're allowed and what you can do with inside it all, and how they have that responsibility given to them in order to do things on your behalf. And I don't think anyone's thought through that in any way. In fact, if you look in the whole agentic AI world, if it's such a mess, that's probably the least of their problems, but it's a very important one.
Well, it'll solved. It'll go, let me ask myself, how do I solve this?
Yeah.
But yeah, on behalf of, historically, I've only ever seen it in two scenarios. One is in a customer support facing scenario where, a customer calls you and says, hey, the website's not working. And so the agent has to act pretending to be the customer on behalf of the customer, right? And the frameworks that I've seen, they were always very much ad hoc, like they were cheating in how they were transporting the customer's identity at the same time as the employee identity supporting the customer.
Yes.
So that was one use case. And then I remember at Salesforce, within the CRM product, they had a feature where an administrator of, say, the sales CRM deployment could act on behalf of an employee using a CRM. So it's a similar thing, but it's not a customer support relationship. It's an internal support use case.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's super interesting.
Yeah. Couple of the terms I picked up on the conference tour. One is identity fabric. It's this idea that the analysts, both Cooper-Cole and Gartner and others, they're saying that the identity community, they've been building user management as an island, and then authentication as an island, and then governance as an island, and then authorization as that. So a bunch of islands, right? All very beautiful islands, but all very disconnected. And so identity fabric is this idea that you're going to be tying these different functionalities together. It sounds like frameworks like Dapr could help in that regard, because you're helping connect these different services and make sense of them all. Although I'm assuming not in an identity specific way, right? You're not focusing on any one particular technology or challenge, right?
No, I mean, we've used Spiffy as a way of kind of handling application identity and what that's all about. But you're right, bringing all these things together. I mean, another piece of that you can use with inside Dapr is it allows you to plug in this concept of a middleware component between the application call or when your application gets called, and so when you're going to call the order method on your order process, and you can say inject in that, you can inject in on that and a call out to OAuth or some authentication framework. And you can reach out to whatever you like. And so, this middleware component allows you to do authentication calls around that. And it might go, before I do this call, I'm going to do an authentication. So it brings kind of OAuth calls into that as well. It has identity as part of it all. And of course, it also uses the identity in order to enforce sort of security boundaries between these things. So I'd like to think that the access control, the authorization, in terms of what you can do, the pluggability to be able to plug in different OAuth providers around these things. We even have actually sort of the ability to plug in. We don't yet have pluggability to kind of replace Spiffy, as it were, in terms of identity. But we sort of have the pluggability to kind of get hold of where the certificates come from that you're going to use to sign all your Spiffy identity things with cert manager and things like this. So as much as we can, we try to be agnostic framework with pluggability into other things. But we have to make some choices.
Yeah, so that sounds really cool. The whole middleware, when you said middleware, like my eyes lit up. Because in the world of access control, there's this whole architecture paradigm that comes from NIST ABAC. There's a paper that NIST wrote called 800-162. It's a very good number. And it's all about this notion of PEP, PDP, PIP. So, sometimes we joke that it's called the P star P architecture. And so the PEP is the enforcement point. It's your middleware. It could be any kind of interceptor. So your middleware or an API gateway, or back in the day, an XML gateway. And that thing is capable of intercepting the flow between the different apps and services and building blocks of the Dapr infrastructure, so to say, and then call out to, you said OAuth servers, but it could also be authorization services like a policy decision point. And so one thing I want to do with you after this podcast is see how we could write an OpenID auth Zen client middleware for Dapr, so Dapr could actually call out to an OpenID auth Zen compliant PDP for authorization decisions. That would actually be quite cool. So
that'd be super cool. Yeah, there's a number of different middleware things that we add in. I mean, there's authorization. You can plug in anything into basically the pipeline between, what gets called from another service to your application, and basically Dapr injects its way in and kind of takes over on that. And, we've had other people do sort of things, including sort of calling out your file system. So you can just sort of check a file, or actually even you can actually plug in WASM there as well as a WASM component. So you can sort of run a WASM function in that middleware pipeline as well, to do a little bit of processing and do transformation on the pipeline. So there's lots of things you can do, but great to do this. I'd love you to donate and contribute into Dapr middleware component. That'll be fantastic.
That would be really cool. Awesome. Hey, next question is for you, Emme. Yep.
Switching the page a little bit. So as David mentioned, we go to conferences, and one thing that keeps coming up at every conference is the popular topic that everyone loves to talk about is AI. It's everywhere. So how are you seeing it affect you in Dapr?
Yeah, we're seeing a kind of a huge shift actually in terms of AI usage. It's kind of interesting. I kind of look at this in kind of a few different perspectives. First, generally the concept of models as a whole, whether they're a vision model, language model, or any other model for that matter, sound model is kind of has transforming the general application landscape, because you can do these things with models with, under machine learning concepts that just would be almost impossible otherwise with just general procedural coding. I think vision's the best example. You'll never be able to write code, or we tried back in the 80s to try and do vision recognition and it all failed miserably. And now we have these models that work and do something, and it's all magic. So I think that's great. So that being incorporated into, general application development. And that's been a trend now for at least the last 4 or 5 years. But I think where this is all going particularly is, of course, language models and what they're doing to humanize and take over what's happening in terms of application development. So one thing we did in the last release of Dapr, we actually introduced a conversation API. And just like a pub sub API that abstracts over message brokers, the conversation API allows you to abstract over and call any underlying language model, whether it's Anthropic or OpenAI or DeepSeek. And so it just gives you a prompt, and then you can call that language model, and you can plug in a component that translates it down. And it adds a couple of features on top of it, like obfuscation of data. So, you're not seeing telephone numbers and social security numbers. And also it does prompt caching. So it adds these features on top of it all. So that's one thing. But I think the general trend as a whole is that I like to, you see, I don't know how much you've come across as a general excitement about agents everywhere. And, there's a lot of agentic systems, which in the end are distributed systems with smarts. That's all they are, or language models. And they've invented lots and lots of new terms around these things. And lots of people are creating lots of new frameworks and sticking things in there. But under the covers, it's very important that they have some sort of very core distributed systems principles, like are they long running and durable? Do they have identity associated with them about who they are? Can they call other systems securely around these things? And so we've introduced back in March a framework inside our Python SDK called Dapr Agents that allows you to take hold of all the Dapr systems primitives and build agentic applications that effectively have memory, use tools, and basically plug into different language models and allow you to sort of work on behalf of creating human-like things, because that's what everyone's trying to do with them. And I think this, in terms of application development, is going to be a sort of pretty big trend over the next few years as people bring together distributed systems and language models. But what we've done in the Dapr agent side of things is we think they're very enterprise ready and enterprise focused, as opposed to, I think, a lot of the other systems they're a little still toy like in what they do. So this agentic trend, I think, is going to be huge, because people are wanting to try and sort of replace what was done by sort of certain human automation with agentic automation. And I have a good example. I was talking to a logistics company a couple of weeks ago. They have a warehouse manager there who sort of every day he cares about what's happening right now, what orders are not going to go out in the next hour, and how do I have to inform customers. And he's constantly like querying his database and figuring these things out and rushing around. And they just want to build basically an agent that basically allows human prompts to figure out what orders are behind, what's happening here, and figure this all out and work on his behalf so he can do other things. So that's kind of one example I thought was interesting. But this is, to answer your AI question, I think certainly a very interesting trend in the application world.
Thanks. That actually brings two questions that I hadn't thought of before. So the conversations piece that you built in Dapr, it sounds a little bit like MCP. Is it similar, or am I missing the point?
No, you're missing the part. It's not quite the same. So the conversation API is just literally how you provide a prompt. So as if, if you walk up to, what's ChatGPT today? It's a prompt over, the underlying model around these things. You choose your model. And then Anthropic is Claude, and they provide their prompt. This just allows you to generalize from a programmatic perspective. You can hand in prompts. MCP is a little bit more, it's really definitely designed just for machines. It's just like, how can one machine talk to another machine and get back a structured way of that information coming back in a way that I can, effectively turn that language model's response into a thing that a machine can use and read. And so MCP is this sort of explosive protocol that's emerged very fast. Of course, it's got, and you're probably very interested in it, that the authentication side of it is just non-existent and dismal, and there's a lot of work to do there. In fact, Microsoft published a pretty interesting paper a couple of weeks back about what's broken about MCP and authentication generally, which I thought was a really good read. I think we should post that link afterwards. But generally, MCP is just that protocol that just allows you to call a language model and get it back some structured information so you can hand it into your application to do something with. And you can effectively stitch these all together like tools, and get them to do things on your behalf, and allow language models to interface with that underlying technology. So, for example, you were building an MCP server on top of Dapr, and you can then, through the MCP server, say, hey, I want you to craft a message topic with this name, and I want you to send it over the Kafka broker and send it to these services. And it will effectively stitch together those APIs for you from a language prompt. Does that make sense? And sort of do magic on your behalf. That's the idea.
Yeah, it does. Thanks for the clarification. And the Microsoft paper, are you thinking of the paper that Aaron Parecki wrote on OAuth and MCP, or is there another one that you're thinking of?
No, I think it's that one. Yes.
Yeah. It's so Aaron Parecki is one of the lead architects, both at Okta, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and very much involved in ATF, OAuth, and OpenID. And so he wrote, what happened is MCP came along, and then the folks behind MCP started writing about authentication, but of course they're not authentication people. So the authentication people, Aaron's community, my community, kind of woke up and were like, whoa, hang on, this is how you're supposed to do authentication.
Yeah.
And definitely it will be a big deal to get the identity piece right. And the authorization piece right.
I'd love to kind of find out more if you're involved in it, kind of just to kind of figure out where it's going, because I think it's a pretty important piece that's missing that we're not really involved with it just yet, but it's going to, I think, become so.
Yeah, I'm on the sidelines. I'm not very good at authentication. I'm much better at authorization. I know it's kind of weird to say, but I keep forgetting how OAuth flows work, and if I hear crypto, I shudder. So yeah, no, authorization is my gem, not the rest. But that's why Dapr is there, though, because it helps me abstract all that away. The other question that we had for you, but yeah, I think you kind of answered it. I just want to stress it again, is that agentic AI is really changing things. Also, the scale, right, of innovation and the scale at which we'll need to connect systems together and figure out their identities and make sure that we know who's calling what on whose behalf, right? Enable access delegation as well. These are things that kind of existed as a challenge before, but not on the scale we see today. So that's going to be
It's going to be huge. It's going to take a long time to figure this thing out as well. I think for all the excitement of it, I think the agentic thing will be very, very isolated to begin with. But if you ever want this idea of like, your travel agent calling up and calling your credit card agent to do a bunch of things, I think there's quite a way to go with that yet. I think luckily we've sort of built sort of pieces of the infrastructure in play around, APIs today and having APIs to kind of do things on your behalf. But I think trusting these agents to do things on your behalf or getting them to do things automatically at the scale that we're looking at, I think it will take quite a while to get there, despite all the excitement around it all, just because identity and security are so hard topics, especially at the scale of the internet. And also people will be very concerned. I mean, I know I would be very concerned if I gave full authority to some agent to go and use my credit card and book flights, and then it came back and went like, what did you do?
what could go wrong? You said you wanted first class.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we'll see. But I mean, it's certainly changing the landscape a lot. And I think there are certainly what will happen for certain is that every single organization has an interesting data source that they own, whether it's logistic data or whether it's, their own data, and they want to build something on top of it that just helps them discover the questions at first. And then, of course, use some agent to kind of do very simple scenarios on top of that. So I think the vast majority, it will become very localized with inside enterprises and organizations first on their data and start there. And I think the world where these things are acting on your behalf on the internet is a long way away just yet at that scale.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me, 10 years ago, there was this first wave of, quote, digital transformation that was driven by the advent of APIs and how everyone could write APIs that were easy to consume and produce. And I went to these seminars, I think organized by Apogee at the time, pre-Google days, where they were saying, oh, but this customer, this insurance company, they were sitting on a treasure trove of insurance claim data. And they realized, oh, we can anonymize it. We can hash it up, mash it up, do some analytics on it, and then sell the intelligence from the data to other insurance companies so they can figure out that, I don't know, in this particular neighborhood of this particular city, the crime rate is so much higher. So insurance insurance policy should be that much more expensive, right? AI is kind of like that on many steroids, like on extremely potent steroids. And well, of course, to the point that it can start, quote, seemingly thinking on its own. So
exactly. I mean, that's the thing that people are kind of starting to think about, where are these reasoning models going? And there's kind of reasoning at two levels. There's a reasoning within the model itself about how it's thinking. And then there's reasoning at the system level as well, where the system has, doing its thinking and how many times do you call a model back and get it to reason and how do you combine that with other things. So there's the model thinking and the system level thinking. And I'm quite interested in the system level thinking because that's the space with the application. But, these reasoning models and how they think, could discover all sorts of things in your data that you didn't realize were there.
Yeah. So quick curveball, vibe coding, good or bad?
Depends what for. If you are wanting to build a website really quickly and put it together and you haven't got any experience and you want to build, I'll give you a great example. One of my sons, he's a game designer. He designs games, yes. And he needed to build a website. He's not got a coding experience. Within a couple of days, he built an amazing website that had great buttons. It was all driven by a spreadsheet. He could put entries inside the spreadsheet that would change the dynamically on the website. And he did this all vibe coding and with lots of great graphics and images using ChatGPT in a couple of days. And he loved it. And he wasn't even a developer. But if you're a systems developer, vibe coding is horrific and you shouldn't go near it in the sense of trusting what's given to you because, two things I think stand out. One is that if you don't, I always love the quote from, was it Lord Kelvin, which was very, very old ago, and he was doing it in the thermodynamics world, but he says, what you don't understand, you can't affect. And it's true for this, what you don't understand. So if you do all this stuff and you don't understand it, and you've introduced 5 security flaws that will, you'll just have a disaster on your hand. So you kind of have to understand this at that level. So vibe coding in a case of producing some secure back-end system that's mission critical, no chance. And you shouldn't go near it, because who knows what you got, because you don't understand it. But, and there's probably a balance in between of those two, of course. And I think it will get more and more. But the concept of really, people replacing your deep architectural approach and all these things, I think is a long way off, despite all the excitement of it. So, yeah, I'll give it like a thumbs up and a thumb down.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks. Emme, over to you.
Okay, so we've talked a bit about Dapr and everything. What are some lessons that you learned, and what are some of the rules that you see? How am I wording this? What do you see in the open source, how it's shaping modern authorization frameworks?
Well, I'm not so familiar with modern authorization frameworks as much, and what they do. I know there's a lot of momentum inside there, and I think the more you have, the merrier around things like OAuth and things. What we're doing with Dapr in many ways is that it's shaping a lot with platform engineering, if I want to bring that into it as a topic. One thing that Dapr has done is it's kind of provided this very clear contract between the platform engineering team and the application team about what they do. And I think that's a very important contract. Whereas before it was like, take this Kafka SDK, stick it into your application. 3 months later, first you have to build the right semantics over and the right behavior. And then everyone says, well, we now have to move to AWS. And so you have to rip out all the code and start again. And Dapr allows you to seamlessly switch out that Kafka component for an AWS component, SNS component, and off you go without having to change any of your code. And I think that's really important. And I think that same principle applies generally, that there should be clear contracts around what an API does and the ability to change the underlying infrastructure or change the underlying authentication provider or things like this, which gets down to abstractions and standardizations. And I'd like to think that a similar thing was happening inside the OAuth world as well, the identity and authorization world as a whole. But I think that's platform engineering place, and that contract is really important. And seeing people be successful where they can switch between Kafka and RabbitMQ and AWS SNS without having to change their code. And I imagine we can do the same thing, like going back to the middleware. You can switch out different auth providers as part of this. So I think that's the thing that I would encourage generally to think about. Providing flexibility and portability across clouds, across vendors, without having lock-in too much. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it did. And then I guess to wrap it up, Mark, and sorry for the sirens outside. There was an ambulance driving down my road. Not for me. What are your takeaways for the future, and what does the future look like for you? Like and also we didn't talk much about Diagrid specifically, so if you want to give a couple words on Diagrid as well.
Yeah. Where's Diagrid? So first I was the creator, along with my co-founder of Diagrid, Jeroen Schneider of Dapr, 6 years ago now, and so we now at Diagrid are sort of the primary maintainers of the open source project, and I think that's kind of super key for us. There's other companies as well that contribute to that. So. And as part of that, one of the services we offer is we, of course, provide enterprise support. The fact that you can come along, we diagnose incidents, discover things that are you want architecture guidance, you want best practice guidance, you want incident management, and we provide all that, along with a great sort of tooling around this. So we have this tool called Diagrid Conductor that allows you to manage and operate and diagnose your Kubernetes environment where Dapr is running. So that's one thing we do, just being core contributors, great open source citizens, driving the project along with others. And then the other thing we've done is, in order to make life easier to consume Dapr, we've built effectively a Dapr server. Think of it as, we call it Catalyst, Diagrid Catalyst, and you can deploy this server product inside your infrastructure. And rather than only being bound to manage Dapr on top of Kubernetes yourself, you can now build your applications and deploy them on container services or VMs, and yet call onto the Dapr APIs and get identity effectively to VM where your application code is running. Or actually it's an identity server. So you can now have identity for the piece of code running on your VM or your function or your container service, and stitch them all together. So your VM with its identity using the Catalyst server can call the function with its identity wherever it's running in any of your environment. So every compute now becomes identity aware using the Catalyst server, which I think is a really cool thing to do, actually, and probably one of its most powerful features. So if you want to talk to about that and how Dapr APIs, identity as a whole, we'd love to kind of find this and come and talk to you.
Oh yeah, I think it's fundamental for us. Being able to have an identity everywhere means that we can enable fine-grained authorization everywhere as well. So it's we're thankful that you're doing that, because it's helping us support customers that want to do that level of authorization.
Yes. So it's exciting, and I think there's a lot of exciting things happening in sort of the application world as a whole, and it's forever changing. And I think that going back to a topic of agents and APIs and how we have identity as a whole and security. I mean, I still think that the zero trust security model and how we get to all that is key, for future application development, and it always has been. And I'm kind of proud to have made it better experience for developers.
Awesome. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you both for this insightful conversation, and Mark for taking time out of your day to join us.
Well, it's fantastic for having me. And I love being here today. I love talking things all about security. It's been super interesting conversation. So thank you.
Thanks. And let's reconnect after the podcast to talk more about how Dapr and Alzen and other standards can work together. And I want to see that middleware thing, see if I can vibe code some integration.
I'm sure you can.
Thank you.
Awesome. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. I'll put all of Mark's information and any links we talked about in the description of this episode, and we'll catch you on our next one.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Dynamically Speaking. Stay tuned for our next one, and in the meantime, check the show notes and connect with us on LinkedIn and YouTube. And visit us at axiomatics.com to learn more about our authorization solution.